January 24th, 1848. A carpenter named James Marshall is inspecting a sawmill on the American River when something catches his eye. A glint in the water. Gold. He tries to keep it quiet. It doesn't work. Within 18 months, more than 300,000 people abandoned farms, families, and entire lives to chase that glint across a continent and an ocean. Ships sit empty in San Francisco Bay. Crews vanished into the hills. Wagon trains stretch for miles across the plains. Men sell everything they own for a shovel and a one-way ticket west. But here's the part almost nobody learns in school. The men who dug in the dirt for 16 hours a day rarely got rich. Most went home with nothing, or didn't go home at all. The people who made real fortunes were the ones who never touched a pickaxe, a grocery clerk, a tailor, a ferry operator, a banker. This is the story of how a gold rush built an economy. And the gold, it turns out, was almost beside the point. James Marshall worked for John Sutter, a Swiss immigrant who had built a small agricultural empire in the Sacramento Valley. Forts, mills, ranches, an entire self-sufficient colony he called New Helvetia. Marshall was building a sawmill for Sutter when he noticed flecks of metal caught in the tail race. Sutter's first instinct was panic, not celebration. He understood immediately what gold would mean: squatters, lawlessness, and the collapse of the orderly empire he'd spent years building. He begged his workers for secrecy. It lasted about 4 months. By spring, the news had reached San Francisco. By summer, it was in newspapers up and down the coast. By December 1848, President James K. Polk stood before Congress and confirmed the discovery himself, holding up a tea caddy of California gold as evidence. That single speech, more than any rumor, lit the fuse for the largest migration the country had ever seen. And Sutter? He was ruined by the very discovery on his own land. His workers deserted en masse. Squatters overran his fields and slaughtered his cattle. He spent the rest of his life petitioning Congress for compensation and died in 1880, still fighting, still unpaid. It's the first lesson of the gold rush economy, and it repeats throughout this story. Proximity to gold did not guarantee profit from it. Sometimes it guaranteed the opposite. By 1849, 3 very different routes converged on the same destination. Overland travelers packed wagon trains and walked the Oregon and California trails. 5 to 6 months of dust, disease, and river crossings, with cholera killing thousands along the way. By sea, ships rounded Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America, a voyage of 5 to 8 months through brutal weather. The impatient took a third option: sail to Panama, cross the isthmus by canoe and mule through malaria-infested jungle, then catch a second ship north, faster but often deadlier. This wasn't a treasure hunt. It was one of the largest voluntary migrations in American history, and it came from everywhere. Miners arrived from Mexico, Chile, and Peru. Thousands crossed the Pacific from China, forming communities that would build much of California's early infrastructure, and faced brutal discrimination for it, including a foreign miners' tax designed specifically to squeeze non-American prospectors. Australians, Europeans, and free and enslaved Black Americans all made the journey too, each group navigating a wildly different set of laws and risks once they arrived. San Francisco absorbed the shock of all of it. A settlement of roughly 1,000 people in early 1848 became a chaotic city of 25,000 within 2 years. Ships arrived in the bay and were simply abandoned. Crews jumped overboard to join the diggings, leaving hundreds of vessels rotting at anchor, some later dragged ashore and repurposed as hotels, warehouses, even a jail. The growth was so fast, so unmanageable, that California skipped territorial status entirely. In 1850, it entered the Union directly as the 31st state, a political fast track driven purely by economic urgency, and a preview of how disruptive this boom would be to every institution it touched. Here's where the real economics of the gold rush begin. And it has almost nothing to do with gold itself. California in 1848 had almost no infrastructure to support a sudden population explosion. Everything had to be shipped, hauled, or grown from scratch, and scarcity turned ordinary goods into luxury items overnight. Flour that cost pennies back east sold for dollars in the goldfields. Eggs, hauled in from Mexico or laid by scarce local hens, could fetch $1 apiece. a fortune at a time when many workers earned less than that in a full day. Boots wore out in weeks on rocky riverbeds and were marked up by well over 1,000%. A single blanket could cost more than a month's rent back home. Housing was its own economy. Canvas tent camps sprang up overnight and were replaced just as fast by wooden shanties, then boarding houses, then hotels, each iteration charging more than the last. A patch of dirt to pitch a tent in San Francisco could command rent rivaling the most expensive real estate on the East Coast. Transportation became an industry unto itself. Mule trains wound through the Sierra foothills. Riverboats churned up the Sacramento River loaded with cargo. Stagecoach lines charged premium fares to move both goods and people into the interior, and the men who controlled these routes built quiet fortunes simply by owning the roads and the boats, not the claims at the end of them. Every link in that chain, the farmer growing wheat in Chile, the sailor hauling it north, the teamster driving it up a mountain trail, the shopkeeper selling it by the pound, took a cut of gold rush money without ever panning a single flake of gold. This is where the legends were made, not in the riverbeds, but behind the counter. Samuel Brannan is often called California's first millionaire, and he never mined an ounce of gold. Brannan ran a store near Sutter's Mill, and before he told anyone else about the discovery, he quietly bought up every pick, pan, and shovel he could find. Then, and only then, he walked the streets of San Francisco holding up a bottle of gold dust, shouting the news himself. Prices at his store tripled within days. He'd created the demand before the public even knew there was something to demand. A young Bavarian immigrant named Levi Strauss arrived to sell dry goods to miners: canvas, thread, buttons, basic supplies. Working with a tailor named Jacob Davis, he helped patent a riveted work pant built to survive punishing labor in the goldfields. The gold rush ended, the pants didn't. They became one of the most enduring brands in American history. Banking solved a problem unique to this economy. Miners had gold dust and nuggets, but no reliable way to weigh, store, or convert it into usable currency. Companies built entire business models around exactly that gap. Wells Fargo, founded in 1852, built its origin story on secure transport and banking services for gold rush wealth. Armed stagecoaches moving gold and mail between boomtowns and the coast. Shipping magnates and import merchants grew wealthy, supplying a population that produced almost nothing for itself and needed nearly everything shipped in. Food, clothing, lumber, even ice carried from as far away as New England. Meanwhile, a far less glamorous but equally lucrative trade thrived in the boomtowns themselves: saloons, gambling halls, and laundries. One often repeated story credits a shrewd businesswoman with making more running a laundry service than most miners ever pulled from a claim, charging premium rates simply because clean clothes were scarce and demand was constant. The pattern held everywhere. Fortune favored those who sold to the miners, not those who dug alongside them. It's worth pausing here because a documentary about economics can't skip what that economy was actually built on. The environmental toll was severe. Hydraulic mining, blasting hillsides apart with high-pressure water cannons, tore through the Sierra Nevada foothills, dumping enormous volumes of sediment into rivers and permanently reshaping the landscape. Downstream farmland flooded with mining debris for decades afterward. The human toll was worse. Indigenous Californians suffered a catastrophic population collapse during this period, driven by disease, violence, and displacement as miners and settlers flooded onto their land with almost no legal protection extended to them. Chinese, Mexican, and other immigrant miners faced discriminatory taxes and, frequently, violent expulsion from profitable claims. For every story of a self-made fortune, there were far more stories of exploitation, dispossession, and loss that rarely made it into the era's celebratory retellings. Understanding the gold rush honestly means holding both truths at once. It was a genuine engine of American economic growth, and it exacted a devastating price that fell disproportionately on people who saw none of the profit. The gold rush's aftershocks reached far beyond California's borders. It had exposed a glaring problem. The West Coast was now economically vital, but brutally disconnected from the rest of the country. A letter or a shipment could still take months to cross the continent. That gap became the justification for one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in American history, the Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869. Four Sacramento businessmen, later nicknamed the Big Four: Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, built the Central Pacific Line eastward from California, again profiting from infrastructure and financing rather than extraction, just as Brannan and Strauss had a generation earlier. The railroad didn't just move people faster, it moved capital, raw materials, and labor at a scale the country had never seen, stitching a fragmented, gold driven regional economy into a genuine national market. Steel, lumber, and manufacturing industries surged to meet railroad demand. Farm goods that once rotted before reaching a buyer could now cross the country in days. The gold rush had built California's population. The railroad is what let that population turn into sustained economic power. By the mid 1850s, the easy surface gold, the kind a single man could pan from a riverbed, was largely gone. Mining shifted from individual prospectors to industrial operations. Hydraulic mining and hard rock mining required real capital: investors, engineers, machinery. What began as an individual's gamble had become a corporate enterprise, run by companies rather than lone dreamers with pans. But the deepest legacy of the gold rush was never the gold itself. It was everything the boom left standing after the gold ran out. A functioning international port in San Francisco, a banking system built to handle wealth and risk at scale, a transportation network stitching the coast together, brands like Levi's and Wells Fargo that still exist today, more than 170 years later, as direct descendants of gold rush era businesses. California's population, agriculture, and economy never reverted to what they were before 1848. The state became a template, proof of concept for a pattern America would repeat again and again. A resource or technology boom draws in a flood of people and capital. Most of the individual fortune seekers come up short, and the durable wealth gets built by whoever controls the systems around the boom, not the boom itself. Oil, real estate, the dot-com era, even Silicon Valley, built in the same state a century later, follows a strikingly similar shape: a rush of ambitious newcomers, a handful of outsized winners, and infrastructure that outlasts the hype that built it. The gold rush promised individual fortune through individual grit: one man, one pan, one lucky riverbed. In practice, it delivered something else entirely: proof that in any resource boom, the deepest and most durable wealth is built by whoever controls the systems around the resource: the supply chains, the banks, the transportation, the infrastructure that's still standing long after the resource itself is gone. Gold made California famous. But it was economics, supply and demand, capital and infrastructure that made America rich, and that turned a muddy sawmill on the American River into the blueprint for modern American ambition.